So I'll spend just some brief time going over kind of what the survey is the trends research is, how we've conducted it, and then I'll just share a lot of the things that we've learned, both statistically and some examples of effective practice. I'll have some pauses throughout, just in case people have any questions or any perspectives they'd like to share. But also feel free to use the chat function if you'd prefer as well. If there's just something that you can't wait, or you want to just capture that thought or that idea, that we'll just roll with it. Working for a design communications company means that often we're perceived as an organization that can make things that look great, that sound great, that we probably do things reasonably well from a project management standpoint. But what can sometimes be missed is where we have strengths in subject matter expertise, in being able to provide some level of strategic advice. In our case, particularly around how companies engage, communicate, and report. Particularly for the past 10 or more years, a strength within the works has been around sustainability, communications, and reporting. And for the past 9 years, this will be our 9th year last summer, that we conducted a trends research project that has generally involved being able to review. It first started off being able to just take a look at companies' sustainability reports, so PDFs and print documents. And naturally, I think we can all appreciate that this is a space that has evolved quite a bit, and it has encouraged us to be able to look at a much wider range of assets. So our sample has increased over time in terms of the number of companies and our regional diversity, let's say, but also the type of assets that we look at. We're now looking at companies, the various types of PDF and print reports they have, but also their use of web. So whether they have microsites or aspects of their website that touch on sustainability. It touches on their use of social media as well. We have a section on digital strategy that comes through there. So that ultimately, I think of this as more of, the best for 2020 sustainability reporting and communication trends and best practices, if we're truly being honest. And frankly, that might make things a bit more interesting to those within this audience. We're not just looking at dirty stuff. We're going to look at things that are probably also a bit more kind of engaging, interactive, etc. Okay, so the research team involved myself and many others. So we had people from our design team, those involved in digital strategy, and those more on the subject matter expertise side, like myself and a couple of others. So it was important for us to collaborate on this project, to provide our unique perspectives and to be able to share those in a kind of a unified way, both sharing them internally within our studio so that we're all kind of in the know of what's happening within the space and we have some perspectives to share, but also in terms of how we share these with clients and how we present it to U of T, and at conferences, and with that kind of wider lens than perhaps the type of lens you might hear from more of a mainstream management consulting firm, for instance. So the sample includes 10 different sectors, so a reasonably even distribution across the following 10 sectors here. And it includes companies mostly from Europe and North America, but also companies from other continents as well. It has been getting wider and wider every year. I think when it first began, it was only North American, then it became North American, European, and more so we're seeing effective practices coming from other parts of the Americas, of Asia, and to some degree, Africa and the Middle East. The topics that we cover are the following 7. And what I'll be doing today is to be able to provide you just a snapshot of what do each of these topics actually mean, what did we learn statistically, and what are some examples of effective practice. So before we get into that, really high level, we wanted to just get a sense of, what are some of the words that people use? Because we see this acronym alphabet soup that's happening often. To some organizations, they've shifted their language from corporate social responsibility to sustainability, and now it's into ESG. That being said, the most common language that is used these days is sustainability. Some companies choose to use ESG if they're trying to do something very intentionally focused towards analysts, investors, and rating agencies in particular. I wouldn't suggest companies use ESG as a phrase to try to engage your employees or communities or anything like that. That's kind of, a little on the nerdy side. And I feel quite comfortable in saying that CSR is dead. Like that is just a phrase that is antiquated, and it really, really screams random acts of kindness to a lot of people. There's one company in our sample, Cisco, where they still use the phrase, and they must have a reason for it. Maybe it is a phrase that resonates with their people, but yeah, no one really uses that anymore. And we wanted to see also, to what extent is there a level of alignment between how companies, or the extent to which companies talk about ESG or sustainability through a report, but also how is that communicated in an annual report? And while this is a fairly superficial scan, we did see that of our sample of companies, 97% or almost all of them referenced sustainability or ESG within the report, obviously to varying degrees. And I'll have some examples to share what that looks like. So when we're getting into leadership and strategy, this topic really touches on the extent to which companies seem to be showing, or the way in which companies are showing how sustainability is aligned to corporate strategy, how it's embedded in the organization's governance, and the extent to which they are reporting in more of an integrated fashion. So in some cases, that might actually mean doing an integrated report where they no longer do a separate annual financial report and a sustainability report. They might be bringing those worlds together into reporting that has a common narrative, where it is focusing on a common set of goals and objectives and KPIs, for instance. In other cases, it might be more of what we call an integrated suite, where organizations may continue to have different reports, but they're released around the same time. They have a common kind of look and feel and key messaging, and the things that they say are generally very similar in terms of what's important to their organization, what they're focused on. But it is with an intention that some audiences want to see things in a slightly different way. So the notion of integration is I think it's kind of evolved over the last couple of years. When we get into this first bucket around strategy and governance, we were pleased to see that year over year, there's been an increase in the number of companies indicating a board level sustainability committee. We've seen an increase in the companies in their reporting, visually showing their governance structure. And I'll give you an example to show why we think that's generally a good idea. And almost half of companies feature a letter from a sustainability executive, in addition to just kind of that high level letter that you're used to seeing from a president and or CEO. So this is an example of a letter that we really liked. It's from Kering, which is a global apparel company. And it's a little bit different, because it's not really a letter, it's more of a Q&A. So it allows you to kind of focus on a handful of topics or issues that are top of mind rather than hearing overly motherhoody stuff. And what's really interesting about this is that this is a dialogue between an organization's chief sustainability officer and their chief financial officer. So, that may give readers a sense that, okay, this is how the organization identifies what's important. These are how decisions are made, thinking about, apologies if it's a bit of an antiquated phrase, but how the triple bottom line is taken into account, financial and non-financial factors into decision making. So this kind of conversational format can be really effective, in addition to that high level message that you may get from your president and CEO or your chair, for instance. From a governance standpoint, we feel like illustrations like this are really helpful, because sometimes companies will share a structure, but they won't really share what falls under the purview of each of these groups. So that's where that kind of additional piece can be really helpful. With Capital Power, you can see that there's a description around their board of directors and specific committees, what responsibilities or topics fall within each of those groups. Additionally, providing some details around responsibilities for the chief executive officer and for those officers that report to the CEO. So it just gives a bit of valuable context. And I really like this example because I think of it kind of functioning as a bit of a tear sheet, but one of the things that is commonly not existing within companies is succinct key messaging for leadership around sustainability. So what this is essentially, it's a 2-pager that I would guess was developed pretty well, once that sustainability report was completed, but it clarifies what are some of the main priorities and issues for the organization, what are some of the targets and the organization's progress in these areas, and some details around their governance. So this is a way to be able to get many people, particularly executives in your company, on the same page in communicating what these issues are, how they're managed, and what are some of the targets. So even if this was in no way ever to be shared externally, it's a damn good tool to be able to get everyone on the same page. Although I think that this carries a lot of weight in being able to share externally as well. Almost kind of like, if you have 5 minutes, this is what you need to know about our company. With integration, this is about the extent to which companies are doing integrated reporting. There has been a decline statistically in terms of companies with a single integrated report, a modest decline. And the IIRC framework is a framework I think I may have presented before, that it's a framework that companies may follow to show their alignment with integrated reporting. Now, as I kind of alluded to, I think that we're probably going to track this statistic in a bit of a different way in the future. Like, because we're seeing more of an integrated suite, we need to be able to appreciate that this is not as binary a situation as what we had in the past, that we may want to be able to try to understand to what extent are companies, let's say, releasing their sustainability and their AR at the same time with a similar kind of look, feel, key messaging, et cetera, rather than assuming that integrated reporting is only about that kind of, one report type approach. So I'm just going to share a couple of examples here, and then I'll touch on some of the questions I think that seem to be coming up in the group chat. Okay, so Philip Morris International. How dare you, Wes, bring up these nasty characters? Now, I think we all probably have some fairly strong opinions about tobacco companies, and that's obviously really fair. It's but we wanted to go into this research with a level of objectivity in terms of, like, how are they reporting? How are things structured? What kind of information are they providing? And to be honest, Philip Morris International's integrated report is probably one of the best ones that we saw in terms of the way that information is laid out, the way that it's illustrated, how clearly it's communicated, that there is quite a bit of balance within the report as well. But the reason why I'm sharing this example is because one of the more important components of an integrated report is for companies to be able to show how they believe they're creating value. Value creation is a very common language that's being used in a mainstream sort of way to allude to sustainability and to serving a wider group of people than only one shareholders. And what you can see here is this kind of sequence of their inputs that are coming into the organization that relate to human capital or manufactured capital or social, for instance. There is a sense of what our business model is and our impacts, and also our outputs. So outputs gives more of a sense of, like, these are the outputs or the outcomes of what we do. So the way that it's structured, laid out clearly, is quite effective. Another one that company that's done a rather good job of this, and these are seasoned experts within the space, ABN AMRO, a Dutch bank, they've done a rather good job of being able to show that sequence in terms of these are the inputs, once again, organized by the different types of capitals, a sense of what the organization's business model is, what their output is being measured quantitatively, and then outcomes give a sense of really more of an update, or being able to provide some qualitative information around what they believe their outcomes were. What is rather unique is this acknowledgement of what ABN AMRO considers to be their positive and negative impacts. And as you can see here, there are several cases here where they acknowledge that they have negative impacts, and some are small and some of them are large. And they relate to different audiences, like or stakeholders, like their clients, employees, investors, and society. So that's one thing that's rather unique. Most companies are not willing to talk about impacts. It's a rather difficult thing to measure and to communicate. There are definitely some issues around attribution of, did we actually did what we do actually result in this impact, or was it a combination of events? Impact's a tough thing to talk about. But with that, I'll just move on to the next topic and answer some questions before I do that.
Sure. I do see one here from Cece, and she wanted to know, how do you think, well, and maybe Cece, you want to unmute yourself, because I think it's connected to a slide that Wes was showing a few minutes ago, but you're talking about the solution to cherry picking. Go ahead.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, is, I wondered, what is the solution for businesses cherry picking on what to report? As more often it's, you mentioned about Philip Morris, and I do know a few other businesses that, for example, mining companies would be, make it huge in their report that they have helped, this organization, this group of society, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, you're still a mining company.
Yes.
You're still part of, a business that takes from the environment and doesn't, you have nothing on your report that says you're going to change, use technology, et cetera, but it all looks good.
Yeah. I mean, the Body Shop takes from the environment too. But I mean, it's just a question of who does it in a responsible way. So I guess I have a section later on in here that it focuses on materiality. And I guess high level, I would just say that what analysts, investors, and others are explicitly requesting from companies in many cases, and David may be able to speak on that a bit coming from NEI, is how important it is for companies to articulate what is material to their organization, how they determine that, rather than this, this kind of cherry picking approach. I'm finding, having been in this space now for about 20 years, that there was a lot more cherry picking that happened in the past. Now, because of some of the greater pressures coming from different groups, companies don't often have as much of a liberty to do that. Because of SASB, because of a greater level of sophistication from analysts, investors, rating agencies, and others, the pressures are higher, and the risks are higher for companies if they are not disclosing information around topics that are considered to be quite important.
Exactly. And the reason why I brought this up is because for us as a business, we've embedded Future Fit Business Benchmark, and yes. And that is, coming to realize that's the holistic strategy. That's the framework that would, there's nowhere for you to cherry pick and, you do good in this because it will offset this part. So
it's very future oriented by the nature of the framework. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's just important, though, to be able to understand who are your key audiences, what do they expect of you, what are some of the topics that should be considered to be important. I think that the Future Fit is a great framework. I just would want to make sure that there is a considerable amount of engagement that continues to understand what is important to those audiences, rather than potentially following something that may feel a bit dogmatic. Yeah.
Good point. Yeah.
I don't think there's really
yeah.
any other question. I'm just seeing from Laura that she's interested in knowing about reporting trends and reporting templates, but I think that was the only real question.
Yep. So I'll definitely share some information, what we call smart reporting sometimes. What are some of the different formats that we're seeing information? And communication trends is coming soon. Okay, so what matters most? That's a heck of a thing to put, because everything matters, right? So what matters most? We basically had two separate sections called stakeholder engagement and materiality. And we think of it from our perspective, one of the first conversations we have with clients before or during a kickoff meeting is, who matters most to you? Who are your key audiences? And what are some of their priorities and expectations? And it isn't to suggest that, their priorities and expectations are the gospel, and that is, you should only focus on those things, but it is certainly a consideration when being able to determine, what is material to one's organization. So, if we first look at the topic of stakeholder engagement, pleased to see that pretty well everyone has not only identified who their stakeholders are, but how they engage with those groups. This would be, kind of how they engage on an annual basis. What are some of the tactics they use, for instance? And also, almost all companies indicate how stakeholder priorities are being addressed. So that kind of sequence of who matters most, how do you engage with them, what do they care about, and what are you doing about it? That is an important bit of information to be framing early on, because it helps provide a level of rationalization for why you're focused on certain areas, and hopefully using this as an opportunity to be able to frame important issues, not only from your company, but from others' point of view as well. So the example from Greater Toronto Airports Authority, one of our clients, admittedly, this is just a simple interactive way to be able to click on different stakeholder groups to provide a brief sense of how the organization engages with these groups and what are some highlights and initiatives. In some cases, there are also hyperlinks to take you to other parts of the report where there are stories that provide further details around different initiatives. This one is totally nerdy, but I love it because it provides a lot of details here. It's not interactive, but what you can see here is a chart that shares who are the main stakeholder groups, what do they expect of us, how do we engage with them, what are the main topics, and what is our response. So I kind of like structurally how it's laid out. It could probably look a bit nicer or a bit less heavy, but KPN, a Dutch telecoms company, the quality of information is quite good. And this is something very different, but the example from NL shares who the company's key stakeholders are and the extent to which their priority topics are considered important to these different groups. So it helps understand that kind of complex dynamic that exists with a company, and perhaps the extent to which they're approaching a topic with one group and maybe not so much with another. Engagement also relates to, how do companies choose to engage with different stakeholders? And one example from Nestle is an interesting one where, for large companies, there may be a reasonably good sense of some of the main questions that people may have to ask. So it's a good opportunity for companies to develop some key messaging, some proof points around, what's up with this whole baby formula thing? Whatever controversies there are, what's up with, the statement you made about water's not a human right from your chairman. There may be an opportunity here to be able to address those, 15 or 20 things as a starting point. And then perhaps providing some supporting articles or providing contact details where people may be able to follow up with appropriate executives or subject matter experts. But the other thing we found interesting is that, and granted, it may not be done in quite the same way now because of COVID, but this great energy debate was something that was hosted by Shell, that featured some of their people as well as other experts to be able to talk about the role that Shell could be playing and to be able to ask challenging questions from a variety of people. So while there are people in this audience, it's obviously doesn't have to be this way. The majority of people asking questions during this forum were online, but to be able to see whether there are opportunities through Periscope or through other tools to be able to have live dialogue, to be able to ask tough questions is helpful. I mean, these Twitter chat things, they only serve, you know, a certain purpose. You don't get to see someone, you don't get to see their emotional response, you don't get to see these nonverbal cues. You know, we're all human, and I think if anything, at this time and age, we're really trying to connect with other people rather than just reading words. So where there are opportunities to do this sometimes, maybe in some cases to do something that is very subject matter specific. Maybe it's going to be around diversity, inclusion, equity and inclusion. Maybe it's going to be around human rights. Maybe it's going to be around climate change. But I think that there's an opportunity to have a forum, whether it's an open forum, whether it's invite only, a way to be able to have a constructive back and forth and to be able to share what was learned from that. And I'll have a pause right after materiality. I kind of see stakeholder engagement and materiality as a great kind of 1-2 punch. So materiality is basically what matters most to organizations. And important components are obviously, and great to see that 100% of companies in our sample identified what their material topics are or their sustainability priorities. And another important component of that is to be able to articulate how you came up with that. What was your process, your methodology for determining what was material? Pleased to be able to see that, pleased to see that roughly 3/4 of our sample illustrated their approach and their priorities. So that's where some of you have seen a materiality matrix before. That's one way to do it, but there are certainly others ways to be able to illustrate both how you determine what is material and what the outcomes of that were. Because let's face it, some companies don't want to say that there are some topics much more important than others. And maybe not everybody needs to, but you certainly don't want to start with the premise of there are 52 priorities. Maybe just to simply say that there are a certain number of topics that we're focusing on is a good start. You know, before getting into what is material, we've seen a growing number of companies like UPM and others first address the megatrends. So this is where a company might make the choice that a big macro topic like climate change, we shouldn't really consider whether or not that's material. It's kind of a moot point. Of course, it's important. But what are some of the things that we can be doing? You know, what are our operations, activities, et cetera, that could be a bit more specific? And that's where it's important, I think, sometimes for companies to acknowledge these macro topics, these mega trends, to acknowledge what their significance is to their organization and whether there are any opportunities, risks, or challenges to have that kind of early on. The example from Clariant shares in a matrix, more of a conventional way, that you know, that the topics in the top right hand, and I'll just pause this for a second because I find this video goes a little bit quickly. This is a matrix to share based on the relevance for the company and the relevance to stakeholders. As we move into that kind of top right-hand corner, those would be the topics where greater emphasis is placed within the report and greater details are shared. What we like about this example is that it's an interactive matrix. So you could click on a topic and learn more about it rather than searching, you know, throughout the report to find where can I find information around environmental protection and resources. So I'll just unpause it to see that you could click on this topic. You could click on a link to take you to that topic in the report where you can learn more about why this topic is important and what the company is doing and perhaps what type of goals or targets that they've set relating to this particular topic. Another way of being able to show materiality is through an illustration like this with Nike. What they've done is they've listed all of their priority issues from top to bottom. And from left to right, they've shown the extent to which these are topics that are material at various stages of their value chain. That's quite relevant for a company like Nike. And I would guess also like CC for an organization like yours as well with Natura / Body Shop, to be able to share that, you know, there are some topics that are incredibly relevant at different stages, and to be able to offer that level of context could be helpful. Now, before I get into storytelling, which is a big old can of worms, a fun one, wanted to just go back to the chat, and after doing that, also just to kind of open the floor, because I know not everybody wants to share things just through typing.
So Sarah's asking, you mentioned the materiality matrix. She wonders if it's becoming outdated as a graphic visualization.
No, not really. I feel like there are different ways to do it. A big reason why some companies choose to not do a matrix is because, like with the Nike example, they want to show that, it's a little more complicated than that sometimes. I know with some of our mining clients, we've been able to share a matrix, but also to say, these are our priorities for the overall organization, but for our operations in Africa or in South America or in Asia, the issues are relatively different because of, of the socioeconomic, political, environmental, whatever consideration. So offering that level of context is really helpful. But I find that sometimes companies may choose not to do a matrix also because they don't want to say that there are some topics more important than others. They don't want to risk someone saying, well, why is health and safety slightly less important than human rights? Even if it's still up there, that can kind of get people's things in a twist. But what goes on that matrix is something that is very relevant. Sometimes we see that there's a matrix that just has the extent to which something is important to the company versus stakeholders. Now there's an evolution of the GRI, for instance, that is suggesting that we shouldn't be thinking about the level of importance. We should only think about impact. And I get that. And frankly, that's something that I'm going to be guinea pigging with one of my clients right now, where we're doing a materiality assessment to see, we should always be asking, how important is the topic to different stakeholders? But really what it comes down to is, where are the areas that the company and stakeholders believe they could make a considerable impact? That's where things kind of get real. So yeah, I don't think it's outdated. I think it's just about how do you share that information, and what is the most contextually rich way of being able to share that kind of information.
It seems so subjective. Some of the ways that companies do it right now, where you get people together in a group and they kind of socialize which ones are the most important. Are you seeing more sort of mathematically based, or as you say, contextually based, science-based methods?
I am finding companies that are using data service providers to be able to help them with the materiality assessment. And while I feel like that can be helpful, it shouldn't provide them with all the answers, because I've been pretty vocally critical of companies who are just leaning on a data company to be able to tell them what is material. Because for starters, companies probably already know what is material to their business. And what is more helpful is to be able to engage with some of those key groups, particularly, let's think about on the investment side, those who own 2% more of your company or something like, to be able to ask, why do you believe those topics should be important to us? How well do you believe we're addressing those topics? What more could we be doing? And where's the puck going, to use that tired Gretzkyism? I think the context part is more valuable than being able to simply know what is material and what isn't. And the problem with the data side is that I don't feel like it gives a lot of context, just kind of tells companies what they should focus on and does a bit of a media scan to get a sense of where noise is coming from. So I find that it's kind of imperfect, but I feel like if you look at where we can use both data and engagement, that's where we can get to a really good place.
Okay. And maybe David, you want to jump in on this one? I was watching some stuff about SASB in the last couple of days, and of course they identify some of the material topics. So Wes, are you starting to see more and more companies kind of looking to SASB to make sure that those material topics are addressed, or relying on them, or reporting or making notes about that? And David?
Yeah, generally, yes. What Larry Fink says goes. I mean, He's been a very vocal supporter of SASB and of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and it's created a considerable momentum. And you'll see that in one of the later slides. But companies are they are definitely referencing SASB and the topics that are coming up for their sector to be able to see to what extent are they touching on those, and to see that as a common baseline. Not to suggest that SASB offers all of the topics that companies should focus on, but there's probably a pretty good chance that the majority of those topics would be ones that, you know, companies should be touching on from the beginning and expanding from there.
Yeah, I would agree with Wes. There's some coalescing around SASB as a reasonable standard, although it's still, you know, pretty much a wide open field. But I think ultimately what that means is that companies increasingly have no place to hide when it comes to producing this kind of information. Wes, I had a question for you. You know, on the chat, I guess probably about a month or so ago, maybe longer, we were talking and really lamenting actually where sustainability sits within organizations, and you know, the tendency in some organizations to stick it in communications or even a marketing function as opposed to a business function. And I wonder, in your surveying of all these reports, whether you were able to draw any conclusions about the quality of both the substance of the report and how the information was presented relative to where sustainability sits within an organization.
I can only state my opinion on it.
That'll do.
I don't have any data to support it, but I can generally say that based on my interactions with companies that have sustainability falling under more of a strategy picture, the quality of information within a sustainability report is going to be stronger. And the level of influence that a kind of strategy / sustainability team has on the information going in a report, rather than it going through the legal comms, various filters and things being cut out, is better. I feel kind of discouraged sometimes when I have a client whose sustainability role has suddenly shifted into the operations department or into the comms department. If it goes into legal, I don't have as much of an issue. You know, legal general counsel or something like that. It depends on kind of where they're at as an organization. Sometimes that can make sense. If it's only falling into HR, I find that problematic. And it often results in companies dialing back what they've done before from a communications and disclosure standpoint. So yeah, I think the more that sustainability rests within an ethics or a strategy or a risk or even a general counsel standpoint, the better, because you're going to be able to there is an expectation that more of a holistic perspective is taken, where you're focused on the best interests of your company, rather than something that might be kind of a side gig or something that is so heavily polished that it just seems meaningless. Does that answer the question? Okay, great.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Other questions?
Nope, there aren't any, I don't think. I don't see any written ones.
Okay. Okay, so let's go through storytelling. Storytelling means a whole lot of different things. And to be honest, and I might have mentioned this before, but some people think of this term in a pejorative manner. And I tend to use the word context when I'm speaking to grumpier people, like people who are not, you can tell that they're not going to be overly enthusiastic about bringing up a phrase like storytelling. So I think of it as context, because storytelling to me is really trying to understand an organization, what it's doing, why it's focused on different areas. Sometimes that involves presenting case studies or examples. Sometimes it is about clearly articulating your mission, your vision, your purpose, the theme of your sustainability report. And sometimes it's about being able to use appropriate, effective photography, illustrations, and video. So it's a big old can of worms. When we get into storytelling at the beginning, we were pleased to see that there is a modest increase in the number of companies following a consistent reporting theme throughout the report. So rather than calling it the 2019 sustainability report, that they have something to say at the beginning. and that it flows into the leadership message, and it flows into some of the case studies. So there is something thematic that's going on that is, often relating to something that's important to the organization. About 20% of companies theme their reports around their purpose, their impact, or their value. So we look for some of those keywords. That's the first time we tracked it, so I can't tell whether it increased or decreased. I would guess it's probably a steady increase every year. But an example of a company, and I cautiously use this example because I think a few of us will remember of the debacle probably 10 or more years ago when BP decided to rebrand themselves Beyond Petroleum, and they didn't really do that. They continue to be very much about petroleum. But what they've done quite effectively this year, and granted they have new leadership, is that with their sustainability report, they called it Energy with Purpose. They clearly articulated what their purpose is on the next page. They have it flowing very well into the leadership messaging. All of their case studies are about energy with purpose. So the theme carries throughout very well, and it does tie to the organization's purpose. And if you look at the organization's website, they've also done a really good job of being able to break down that purpose in terms of how they see things filtering into various elements of their operations and activities. ABN AMRO, accelerating the sustainability shift. They've done a rather good job of addressing some of those mega forces, as we talked about before, being able to talk about the world around us, what is going on, and as a result, what are we doing to be able to have an important role of being able to drive some level of positive change, and using kind of a vignette or a thematic approach in the earlier parts of the report. And with Greater Toronto Airports Authority, they're all about being able to show how they partner with others, how they work with others, whether it's municipalities, businesses, and others, to have a considerable impact on the economy, local economy, national economy. And they do that through testimonials from various different people within and outside the organizations, using video as well. So really trying to create a bit of an emotional response and to give people an initial sense of, why does this organization exist, rather than here's our encyclopedia from 2019. Fill your boots. A second element is around providing supporting content. So this is around the extent to which companies share case studies. We have seen both a dip in the number of companies sharing case studies within the report, as well as reports including videos. And when having a bit of a geek out with some of our creative colleagues, we came to the conclusion, or at least the hypothesis, that companies are using their websites and social media to share case studies. Reports are intended to be as concise as possible. And what we're seeing in place of case studies sometimes would just be a brief proof point, something that may cite an example of an initiative to be able to show that, okay, this is how we've moved beyond our policies and our programs. And then you can click on that to go to the website to be able to see a video or to be able to read a long form case study. So it's a case of, fit for purpose. And, the beauty of having case studies on one's website is that you can share them individually. You can share them on social media. You can learn more about those audiences. You're not sending a message to say, hey, read my report, because the masses aren't clamoring to read your report. But there are a lot of elements within that report that may be super interesting to people. And as much as you can carve that out and include some of those elements online and to share them in such a way, the more you might be able to meet those expectations and also learn, pardon me, from those audiences. We did find, however, that more than half of companies included case studies or information relating to a negative event. That was a big increase from last year. It's still not okay. Every company has negative events happening to them. And we shouldn't be seeing sustainability reports as an opportunity to just tell good news stories. So for us, we strongly encourage companies to be able to talk about negative events in their report, because let's face it, someone who's going through the effort of reading through your report, they probably are aware of some of those negative events, and they want to see how they've been framed and whether something has been learned from them and what is the company doing next. So yeah, we see that even though that number has increased quite a bit, there's certainly room to grow. So in terms of case studies, This is a great example with the Heineken integrated report. You have that thumbnail on the bottom of the left-hand image that just kind of alludes to, so we wouldn't consider that to be a case study. So that would be kind of an example of, this is just we're just mentioning something briefly, but then that case study, you can click on this to go to the website where it actually provides it in longer form, whether it might come up as a video or as a long form text-based report. So that's where we kind of see things going. And it's the type of approach we've taken with companies like Vancity for several years. In terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly, as much as I'm not really Walmart's biggest fan, they've done a reasonably good job recently to be able to share what they believe are some of their challenges relating to different parts of their business. And these are certainly not all challenges that they face only themselves. There may be a reflection on, complexity within their supply chain or regulatory issues or other things. But at the very least, something like this helps the reader understand the world that Walmart works in, to help them understand where there may be limitations in some cases, or why they're making certain decisions to focus in different areas. So framing these as challenges is helpful. I think it shows a certain level of humility and honesty. I think of it as a no-brainer. This is an example of a video that came from RBC. So if we're thinking about words on a page, we're seeing more and more companies investing in videos. In this case, it's a particular campaign that RBC has around fighting workplace bias that they call that little voice. So while the company can talk about the initiatives they have underway around diversity and inclusion and workforce inclusivity, this is an opportunity to be able to share, that everybody, people do need to speak out. They need to step up when they see some level of inequity or injustice happening. So this took the form of a video of a website that they created as a bit of a social campaign. So, rather than companies simply talking about what they do and what they're focusing on, to provide some level of outreach, or I should say advocacy, that's the right word, advocacy around different issues. And in some cases, they have a guide you can download, to provide some level of support on maybe what other organizations or individuals can do for this particular issue. But when we're looking at videos as well, there are sometimes more playful options, like with BP. Spencer Dale is their chief economist. So this was kind of a bit more of a lighthearted way to be able to talk about some important issues relating to climate change, relating to the future of energy. So clearly they worked with a creative firm to be able to pull this together, having some people in the background kind of doodle things away. So, I think that there's also a time and place to create things that are a little bit more fun and lighthearted. And I don't think it's making light of some of these issues, but, to have things in a very serious tone can sometimes be hard, be hard to be kind of looking at some of this stuff all day. And if this is developed in a way where, in this case, BP's talking about their understanding of issues, of what they're planning on doing in the future. Surely, people may be critical of what they're doing, but they're trying to do the best they can to keep things in very simple terms and using visual cues to communicate what they're doing in this space. There are a couple of issues that we covered as well in storytelling. The first is a rather negative issue, and the other one's a rather positive one. So COVID-19, anybody hear that? So there were a number of companies who we worked with early this year where they provided absolutely no information in their report around COVID, because their report was released like in January or February. And it was really, this was rather early on. But for any company, I would say, that has released a report even like the beginning of May and later, they've generally included some details around COVID. And some of the more effective examples would be ones where companies would first acknowledge in their leadership statement how this has impacted their organization and key steps taken, but also being able to inject case studies throughout the report relating to different areas, like a section on one's people or on customers or on other considerations, to show that this is not the COVID report, but it is important to be able to share what we're doing in these different areas. And we're seeing actually more recently how COVID's feeding into the risk sections of the report as well. And in all cases, very valuable to provide a hyperlink because to one's website, because of course, COVID is very fluid. The report represents a point in time, and to click on that update would allow you to have more updated information around what the company's doing around COVID. One of our own examples was Greater Toronto Airports Authority, because this report was released around May. We had a more optimistic tone, I think, that was originally planned for this. Fortunately, we were able to use some of the B-roll from the video, and also to create some new communication for the website that was in a more of a sobering tone. If we're looking at providing a lot of images of local partners or leaders, that it is, some of the words that they, that came from the interviews are more appropriate, but also looking at how we can inject language throughout the report that acknowledges, I honestly don't know which organization, which sector has been more affected by this than airports. We just had a kickoff meeting with Greater Toronto Airports Authority this week to think about, okay, what's our approach going to be in the coming year? And I'll admit some of the themes are rather interesting. I can't share them, but they're certainly still very focused on community, on collaboration, but also on resilience. You have to be thinking about how an organization like they or hospitality are responding to this. With Western Union, another example of a quick pivot report release was end of May, looking at where we could adjust language in the leadership letter, having sections around COVID throughout the report, and having a link to the company's website. And finally, with NL, probably one of the best examples I've seen, not one of our clients, and most of the examples in this presentation are not, by the way. This was about having leadership statement, having COVID threaded throughout the report, having case studies, including information within their risk section. So this is in both within their sustainability and integrated report, and then having an updated link, a link to the website to provide updates around their response to COVID. The more positive topic, I would say, and one that we were fortunate to see many examples of, is around zero. And zero relates to climate change. And this is where we developed this, witty few words here of, Gore had us thinking, Greta's had us doing. And there's no stopping the boundless imagination and inspiration of companies that are truly committed to ambitious action on climate change. So what we've seen a little bit different this year compared to others is that companies are really focused on 2030, or perhaps farther in the future, perhaps to some degree to align to the SDGs, or at least to think long term. There is a focus on moving towards zero rather than less ambitious goals, I guess. A few examples we've seen here. Nike are talking about what they're doing within their operations and activities, but also really trying to show, I don't want to say celebrities, often athletes, people who are well known or should be, kind of acknowledged in some cases for their contribution in these spaces, to be able to create a bit of more of a common space around climate change and to help appreciate that these are issues that a lot of people care about. So while Nike uses this opportunity to talk about what they're doing, they're also showing that this is an issue that crosses, borders, race, etc. The example I really liked, one example I really liked came from Derwent London, which is a real estate company in the UK. I liked it because they came up with a 2030 net zero target. But they also showed that this was not some sort of a frivolous target, that it's like, totally aspirational. They give short-term targets to say, in order to get to 2030, these are the things that we've done currently, and these are the things that we need to do in 2020 and 2021 to get us on that path. So it's almost how I think some of us have heard about the concept of backcasting. But in order to get to somewhere far in the future, we really need to give some thought about what needs to happen in the midterm so that we can plan to achieve this goal rather than having it as something that is purely aspirational. And another great way to address zero is through collaboration. So Maersk, one of the largest, if not the largest shipping company in the world, talks about their collaboration with their shipping partners like H&M, Levi's, BMW, and others on how they're setting some joint goals and priorities around climate change. So the focus is we can't do this ourselves. We need to work with others to think of thoughtful ways and ambitious ways to be able to address climate change. The last category I have around storytelling is around photography and illustration. And so I'm sure some of you here will probably appreciate companies have been, making some budget cuts lately. We certainly saw it with COVID, but even before that time, for us as a design company, we're really trying to find what to work with sometimes when it comes to encouraging companies to take high quality photography of their people, of their operations. Sometimes it makes sense, we don't need to be snobs in this debate. There are opportunities to engage with one's employees and others to take shots of events, of people, etc. But, we really do want to think about certain elements like a cover or a homepage, for instance, of executive photographies and others where maybe it does make sense for us to be able to invest a bit of time and money and energy in things that we want to create, that we want to repurpose, that are going to be emotionally charged, that are going to be thought-provoking, for instance. But yeah, that continues to be a challenge to be able to get that investment at times, and sometimes relying on stock photography, which doesn't always work. The second point is roughly the same number, from 43 to 42% of companies are offering supply or value chain illustrations. And what that means is, companies developing illustrations to help people understand what do they actually do? How do they create value? How do they interact with other parties to be able to achieve their objectives? If I think about, gosh, even a company like BP that is such a well-known company, do most people really understand what BP does? Like Maersk is one where it's holy moly, Maersk does so many different things. And to have an illustration that captures generally what they do might be a great thing to include early on so that there's a common understanding when they start reviewing what the company does, that there's a reason why they're talking about some issues more than others and having certain expectations. So photography, just one example I want to share here is with Mirvac, a real estate company in Australia. They've done a great job of investing a few dollars in taking shots of their assets, of their people, and looking at how we might be able to, or how they're not one of our clients, how they would be able to use some of the assets to be able to, images like this to include their highlights alongside their people, alongside their assets. And, when you have case studies where it's possible, I guess nowadays to have people a bit more spaced out or wearing PPE, but to show people in action, to be able to show their assets rather than relying on, let's say, stock photography that may be a bit more metaphorical. Metaphors don't always work. At least all the time. And I think that it is an area that companies should make at least a modest allocation towards. And when we look at illustrations, Nokia has done a rather good job of using some illustrations like this to show when it comes to different, when we're talking about impact, what they've done here is to show for the different aspects of their value chain where they believe they have low or considerably positive or negative impacts, low or high impacts that are either positive or negative. So they've kind of laid that out here. And of course, it's explained throughout the report, kind of digging into the weeds, but that kind of acknowledgement that we saw early on from ABN AMRO. and tell us, one of our clients, just having illustrations like this to be able to show how they work with different value chain partners. Cisco is another example of a company that's done this rather well, to show how they work with others and how they want to be able to create value among different communities. These type of illustrations take a bit of time to be able to develop, but they're often the types of things that can be highly repurposable. So before I get into smart reporting, I just wanted to open the floor up to see if there are questions.
Yeah, there is one there from Sarah, and Sarah, it's a little long. So would you like to unmute yourself and ask it directly?
Oh, yeah, sure, Wes. Hi, thanks. This has been so great. Just wanted to ask about, organizations when they have, strong ESG or sustainability teams. Do you find they're starting to bring their own sort of comms people into those teams, or are they still working, bridging over to the traditional marketing and comms department? Because it seems to me that some of the more advanced reporting we're seeing here, a lot of those additional pieces are so channel specific that it almost feels like they're getting to be real experts. And I wonder whether you find they're starting to have their own comms people or still working with your traditional team.
I find with most companies, the ones that tend to do things fairly well tend to bring their comms and their IR people in very early in the game. So when we're having a kickoff meeting, it doesn't include only a sustainability team, it includes people representing some of these other parts of the business and we would use this as an opportunity to present things like trends, to give them a lay of the land, and also to have a bit of a discussion around what are we trying to achieve this year. Just so that they're not people who are just brought in at the 11th hour to approve different things. They need to understand, like, what are we trying to do here? What's the objective? What's the end game? And making sure that people ultimately they feel like there's a sense of purpose that they have. They're not just in here to give a stamp of approval or to be a critical eye. There's a common understanding of what are we all trying to accomplish. And what I would say is a lot of companies don't have the liberty of having a larger sustainability team that has a really strong comms component to it. Most companies are working with their communications teams, their investor relations teams, and others to be able to do a great job. And frankly, I think that that's a better way to do it, because it is about having this feed into different parts of the business. If you have a sustainability team that just continues to get stronger, but they're not working with others, to be able to get them involved in the process and to get them involved in subsequent communication, then that could be an issue. And I realize it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like you just choose one or the other, but that's my 2 cents worth. Any other questions? I see Shauna had something. We're working with a microphone. Okay,
Yeah.
so with Shauna, I'm going to share some examples actually coming up right now with smart reporting around ones that we think are reasonably effective.
I don't really see anything else other than that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll just close this box and move on to smart reporting. So this has been an interesting one because we did find that there's a decline in the number of companies posting report content in the sustainability section or silo of their corporate website, and a decline in the number of companies posting sustainability content on a specific microsite. And I think what we're seeing, once again, hypothesizing, is that that more companies are having a sustainability silo that provides high-level information around their kind of objectives, their goals, their priorities. And for people to dig into the details, that's where PDF or other kind of separate options are often what is being provided. So, the reason why companies might have a microsite, for instance, is if there are considerable constraints within their website, you may want to have a separate site that has fewer rules and allows you with a bit more creative liberty to be taken. Not a big change there. I guess with really either stats really. But you know, that's the reason why you might choose to have a microsite versus a silo of the website. And in many cases, companies may have actually a strong sustainability silo that is high level, and they may have a separate page or a microsite that offers like a summary of their report. If they're if they're really trying to engage people around the report, to provide more of a summary, videos, interactivity, etc., rather than assuming or wanting a large number of people to read that PDF. Roughly 90% or a significant spike of companies offering a variety of disclosures in an analyst hub. So this kind of gets a little bit to what I was mentioning, but you know, what we've been developing and what companies seem to be interested in doing is having a page of their website rather than an investor relations section and an ESG section, having kind of one section that has everything that people, or a lot of things that people would be interested in finding. You know, analysts, investors, rating agencies, experts, their lens is changing. What they're looking for is expanded. So trying to get things into a single place is, we believe that that'll be more helpful. And in that case, it comes down to really great information architecture. Like, how are you structuring this information so it's going to be easy to find? It might actually end up being really boring to look at. But if you can really easily find what you're looking for, that is so much more important than having all sorts of bells and whistles. And that's a big thing for me to say coming from a comms company. So this example from Vancity is a reasonably good example of a company where we've developed their annual report for several years. And the PDF has always functioned as that universal source of truth, that one document where you can find everything that you're looking for. But for the past 3 years, we've developed a microsite that is more targeted to their members and others, where it gives you a snapshot of leadership messaging, a summary of their performance. That's where we have those long form case studies that take the form of words and videos. This is just something, frankly, we can learn more from audiences. We can share things individually rather than you know, assuming that their members are all going to be reading something that's approximately 80 pages long. The Merck example here is another really great, a great job of a microsite. And they're a big, complicated pharma company. This is a web page that has a high level of interactivity where you see these kind of accordion, expand, contract options, where there's a hover state that defines words that people may not all understand. There's tagging at the bottom of the pages that show on which page which disclosures are included. You can click on those to go to like a GRI index, for instance. And there's also an option to be able to compare this report from the previous year's report. I've never seen that before. I think it's fascinating because it does help people understand what has changed from the previous year. And it also gives companies an opportunity to not feel like they need to write their report from scratch every year, that they can just simply build off of it in some cases where they're in cases where some things haven't changed, like policies and management disclosure related information. I think, yeah, I have a hub example coming up in just a moment, but I think I just organized a few things in the wrong order, but it's coming up soon. Complementary publications, a huge spike. 92% of companies have topic-specific reports. Because of the TCFD and the need for companies to talk more about climate change, about issues like diversity and inclusion, in mining sector like tailings, they're often developing these sometimes very brief, sometimes just pulling some pages from the report and having it as a separately downloadable piece. In other cases, it's pulling some of those pages and adding a bit more data or content to it. But that is very common these days, to be able to meet different audiences, where to meet them where they are, and to address the topics that are top of mind to them. And at the same time, over half of the companies have a separate downloadable data piece. So instead of having only the one document that has everything in one space, just having a separately downloadable Excel table or a PDF with a table that just shows their performance. So the example from Heineken, this is their integrated report. You have the option to read the whole darn thing, or you can download their GRI reference table, or download their environmental data table. So this is just one of those things where there are certain audiences that want things in a certain way. And to be honest, I think it's a lot of companies really trying to figure things out, as well as analysts and investors to figure out what is the best way to share this information? How do we want to see it? This seems to be where companies are going, moving in this particular direction. For topic-specific reporting, TCFD or climate change reporting is becoming very common, whether it's BMO or tech or many others. This is a common, unique disclosure that companies are making. And another approach to topic-specific reporting from Cisco allows for them to be a little bit more of an advocate or a way to do outreach. This isn't just a fact book. This is about being able to help people understand, in this case, about internet access and equality, to be able to help people understand the issues. It isn't just about telling people what Cisco is doing, but to provide some level of outreach. And the example here with Ørsted, this is if you only have 5 minutes example. So this is their executive summary. I love it to bits just because, you know, it is really to the point, and it acknowledges that there are some folks who they just want to be able to read the high level. So this is one option in which that, you know, companies are doing that. My apologies, I don't have an example of a hub here, but you're welcome to go to Hudbay's disclosure portal. That's a really good example of a hub that has everything in one space. It's really easy to follow. I think if you just do, I think it's called the disclosure portal and Hudbay, you'll be able to find that. So before I get into digital strategies, just wanted to see if there's any Q&A. Digital strategies relates to social media.
Any questions from some of the discussions, you know, those breakout reports? I love to see that, those TCFD reports coming out separately. Any questions from any of that? No questions from Angela. All right, great. No, it looks like we're all good, Wes. Thank you.
Okay, thoroughly, brain's about to explode from so many examples and stats that are being shared. Rest assured, this slide deck will be provided afterwards if it hasn't already been loaded. The first element around digital strategy is report promotion. You know, just getting down to brass tacks of if this is research on reporting, to what extent are companies actually promoting the report using social media? And this is an interesting stat because COVID happened. And so for companies to develop a sustainability report and COVID happens, I think we believe that a lot of companies chose against doing promotion at that point in time because it may seem a bit tone deaf for companies to suddenly talk about a report when there are so many more things for them to be talking about and to trying to engage others about. So I don't think that this will continue to be a dip. But yes, naturally we saw that reduction in companies promoting their report and a smaller reduction of companies reporting their report, promoting their report on their corporate website. So one good example of companies promoting their report on their corporate website, Capital Power, they used a number of these, I forget what these are called. They're not thumbnails, kind of banners, more or less. They've included them in different pages of their website. So a bit of repetition for effect, including them kind of on the homepage and in other parts, just for people to be encouraged to click on their integrated report to be able to download it to review. But another really interesting thing that I haven't seen a company do before, and while they're our client, we had no role in this in all honesty, but we certainly plan on beg, borrowing, and stealing this approach, is that Capital Power started with the story, and then they had this kind of piggyback approach where they have the story at the beginning, and then they got a piggyback of like, by the way, you can view more on our report. So that way, the first message isn't about the report. It's always about kind of the issue or the outcome or, you know, the highlight, for instance, and then having something afterwards. So I thought that I'd be interested in seeing how effective that is, but I would guess it probably has worked well. And with city developments, they actually had a rather dramatic start to their website, changing the climate, changing the future. This was a campaign they have on their homepage to introduce people to their integrated report. That's quite front and center. When we're looking at editorial content, this is where we saw a small increase in the companies maintaining a blog with sustainability content. Almost all companies using owned content as part of their social strategy, and a fairly significant increase in the companies sharing earned media or being able to share what other organizations have to say about them. It's not totally it, but I'll share some examples of what that looks like. But it's the essence is owned content is what you create. Shared earned media is where you might be able to get other people speaking about your organization. So you're not spending the whole time beating one's chest, but hopefully getting other people to beat your chest. How's that for a visual? So Shell, they've done they've been working with media providers like Bloomberg to be able to have reasonably candid interviews, like in this case with their CEO, Ben Van Beurden, to be able to ask questions around climate change in particular. So where there are interviews where there are opportunities to interview your senior executive by a news provider, there are obviously risks associated with that, but it's a great way to be able to reach more of a mainstream audience, so it doesn't feel like something that has just been created by the company for the public. I really like this example from Veolia. They partnered with the New York Times to be able to create a more or less a microsite. As you can see in small print, it says a paid post, but this is where they created a piece on a new vision for plastic and around the circular economy. So this is something that was, I would say, mildly interactive, but a way to be able to help people make an association with their organization and circularity, to be able to bring light of different issues and the role that they're playing within that space. With integrated marketing, this is where we did see a considerable dip, and I would consider that also to be COVID related. Companies promoting innovation contests, crowdsourcing sustainability solution. COVID happened, so I would guess that had some role to play in that reduction, but only a hypothesis. And we did see a modest number of companies working with influencers to be able to amplify their reach. One example, RBC, they had a Speak Up for Inclusion campaign that included a lot of activity on social media. It included certain assets like these opportunities for you to include your picture here, to associate yourself in your support of International Women's Day, for instance. Also having some actual like physical assets in their office, obviously before COVID, but looking at where not only you have these structures that exist, but the middle image shows how there's instructions to be able to say, this is what what you can do to be able to show your support. So it allows for there to be kind of a consistent way in which people are showing their support for this campaign around International Women's Day and being able to speak up for inclusion. I really like the example here from a couple of examples here from Ørsted also. They are, of course, a renewable energy company, are providing a lot of outreach, a lot of helpful information around how homeowners and others can act now on climate change, providing a variety of resources, but also focusing on younger people, creating storybooks, for instance, Is This My Home? Really trying to take a lighter approach, something that has optimism associated with it while bringing light to important issues. So, I think it's fascinating for companies to be able to take some of these types of approaches to see, and often with companies doing some of this stuff, it's about trying different things and to see what works. So a rather dramatic shift now, going from digital strategy to frameworks. This is our alphabet soup of SASB, SDGs, and others. But when we get into these, with the SDGs, everyone under the sun is supporting the SDGs in some form or fashion. And that's good to see. But you know, where things get a bit more authentic is where companies are actually showing how they align to particular sustainable development goals and to show their contribution or their impact for those targets, as I think we've had a chance to talk about before. A couple of good examples, Maple Leaf Foods have made those clear connections, showing their contribution towards the targets, to targets under the SDGs. So once again, choosing a limited number of SDGs and showing your contribution towards a limited number of targets, rather than feeling like this is a tick boxing exercise. And Heineken did a great job in this case of being able to show for their sustainable development focus areas, how each of those align to one or more SDGs, and within particular sections of the report, to be able to show what targets they're aligned to, what they believe their contribution is in these areas, and also what is the corporate commitment, you know, beyond just showing kind of an alignment to the SDGs, to show what is the organization actually setting as a goal or a target. When we get into the GRI, SASB, and TCFD, roughly the same number of companies are reporting to GRI, 85%. That's a lot. You know, that means that they are still the main act in town, only down from 86%. But at the same time, as I mentioned, what Larry Fink says goes. He is the head of BlackRock. He's made some very, you know, forthright statements around the importance of particularly publicly traded companies aligning with SASB and with the TCFD. As a result, or at least, you know, at the same time, at least, companies, a significant number of companies, an increasing number of companies are reporting to SASB, 26% from 17, and 64% are providing a detailed response to the TCFD, compared to only 28% in the previous year. So what does that look like? With Western Union, they have been reporting to GRI in the past, just as many others. Unfortunately, there are many connections you can make between SASB and the GRI. So to be able to make those alignments ensures that companies don't need to start from scratch. And something like this is often an organization that analysts, investors have appreciated as well, based on our experience doing this for a few companies and their interactions with the street. When it comes to TCFD, BMO included this illustration within its sustainability report, but it also has a 2019 climate report. This is just a brief illustration that shows how BMO is aligned to each of those four main areas of the TCFD, but they also have many of additional pages that kind of flesh out each of those areas around governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And this is what I consider kind of the bad mamma jamma. This is like the chart that we developed with Newmont that kind of has like everything in the kitchen sink in it. We started with the GRI index, and we aligned the GRI to SASB, the TCFD, and the Sustainable Development Goals. There's an additional standard called ICMM that is reserved for mining companies, but this was a heck of an experiment to do this. It's something that Newmont was clearly aligned with, and we were very pleased with the result in terms of how well it was received by analysts, investors, and rating agencies in particular. I have one category left, which is performance. So I'll just present these and then we'll open up for questions, since I know that we're a little bit limited on time. But performance is all about being able, for the extent to which companies are not only communicating their performance, but also the extent to which they set immediate and longer term targets. So we were delighted to see that the stat went significantly down from 36% to 8% of companies that are offering short-term targets. So that means 1 to 2 years. So I don't want to give you a sense that longer term means 2030. It doesn't. It just means 3 or more years. But 78% from 52% is a great thing to see. I'm encouraged by it, but I still want to continue to give my clients a kick in the butt where they need it, so that they are continually focused on longer term and they're able to articulate their ambitions in such a way. So ESG performance, I'll just get right to the examples. Alliance Data done a reasonably good job of having that separately downloadable data table, being able to show 3 years of data. They don't have any targets yet, but even for companies that don't have targets, show at least 3 years of data, and where you can make those connections to GRI and SASB disclosures, all the more convenient. And I believe just 2 more examples. This one from UPM does a great job of being able to share what are the company's economic, social, and environmental focus areas, what are their targets, and what are their results. 2030 target followed by their immediate targets and results to give a sense of progress. I feel like the next example does an even better job from City Developments because it gives that kind of street light approach, red, yellow, green. You know, to what extent are we moving along in achieving or moving towards 2030? And it also happens to show how different goals align to particular sustainable development goals. That's it for today. That was a lot. I know it's a lot to cover. There's certainly some areas that you'll be more enthusiastic about than others, but let's spend the rest of this time answering some questions.
Okay, Sarah has a very specific question about the link for the Orsted quiz / content that you shared.
Yes.
Does it still exist? She says she couldn't find it online, if it was still live or whether or not it's gone. That's her question.
Let me check. I don't know if it still exists, to be honest. It may have gone kaput since this time. They tend to be just up for a certain period of time, but I'll check.
I'll drag the puck here a bit while people identify their other questions or raise your hand or unmute yourself. I'm kind of interested with the amount of data that we're starting to see and those data pages and the hubs and that sort of thing. Does that mean that companies would then get less requests, surveys to fill out and that sort of thing? Is that what they were trying to do? Because the analysts can go directly to the hub and pick up that data, or is there still kind of a real movement towards companies having to fill out surveys for investors and other groups?
So what we found in the past couple of years is companies or rating agencies are able to initially kind of fill out a survey based on publicly available information. So when you look at the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, for instance, Sustainalytics, MSCI, those are often, they will take a first stab at being able to answer those questions. Whereas with CDP, no, the onus is on the company to be able to answer those. And really what you want to be able to do, even if you find that those rating agencies are taking a first step, get all of your information out there, make sure that it's easy to find so that way there's very little work on your part, that when they bring that survey back to you to say, this is our understanding of where you're at, that you don't need to go back to the well. You don't need to go back to your colleagues to answer certain questions, that it's all there.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? I was listening to this SASB interview today, and they were talking about the concern over liability and transparency, and that some companies are worried about publishing some data, and it's just probably a US thing, but nonetheless, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
About liability and
being overly transparent, or that there was some concern that some of the SASB requirements were almost asking people to be too transparent, according to some companies.
I don't know. Sometimes companies have their reasons for it, but I don't think that that's an overall observation. I mean, the thing with SASB is it isn't a requirement that companies report to all the SASB disclosures. They could just disclose to whatever ones they want to. And there may be some reasons where there's a disclosure that they find there's some sensitivity around it, and they're not legally obligated to report to them, so it's entirely up to them whether they want to. But it's also important to understand that there are risks in not disclosing certain things, and that may relate to there being proposed shareholder resolutions coming up. It might relate to companies deciding to stop investing in you, or that you have the opportunity of facing the stick rather than eating the carrot because you've decided against disclosing even fundamental details around certain issues. So I would just take that as a case-by-case basis. I mean, SASB was developed with a fair bit of consultation across different subject matter experts, and including many people from industry. Like, I would consider SASB to be a very industry-friendly standard. It's not overly aggressive in in many cases, but it's important for companies when they look at something like that, if they haven't done this before, to acknowledge that they don't need to do it all at once. There may be many cases where if SASB is asking for 14 things for you to report to, you can report to 7 of them. And there might be another 5 that you can use your year to set a baseline towards. And another 2, you might decide that you're not going to report to them. And, you know, it's really just about continuing to engage with your audiences and to find out, for those who own your company or for others who have a considerable influence, whether you're meeting expectations, and to give a sense of where those expectations are changing over time.
Okay, and then we'll go to one last question. I see Tanya, and I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask this question.
Sure. I mean, it's not so much a question, Wes. Thanks for the shares. I guess one of the things that we're seeing in disclosure and reporting increasingly is this push towards both a life cycle approach in terms of upstream and downstream activities and interdependencies, as well as asset level disclosures. So if I take the ICMM performance expectations as an example, as of next year, there will be as of this year, actually, as of the next reporting cycle, early 2021, there will be asset level disclosures required.
Yeah.
So that's a new, let's say, a new requirement that seems to be pushing rather quickly.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I know that sucks for you guys that need to do that are pushed towards asset level, but it gives a sense for analysts, investors, and others where there are relative risks across the different regions where you're operating. So, you know, I think that level of context is often helpful, and you know, even through through the Church of England's recommended disclosure around tailings, that's specific. You know, if we look at TSM towards sustainable mining, site specific. And even if we look at GRI, you know, what they're looking for is often fairly site specific around different data points. So, you know, I think that's a natural request to be coming. When it comes to life,
I think what's interesting, what's interesting though is what people can do with it. So whereas the life cycle data allow downstream customers to start to be selective and understand the full spectrum of impacts from who they do business with, the asset level disclosures seem to be more geared towards CSO, NGO type readers, because there's not much decision. You know, when you buy metal from a company, you don't know which asset it's coming from a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like apples to apples comparisons are being made site to site, like, or from company to company. It's more just figuring out where there are considerable changes in your health and safety record, in your spills, and is that relative to increases in production, increases in employees. So I think that, yeah, I know it's complicated, but it's like, and what we mean by asset level is like, that means related to your different sites. So if you have a mining site in Guatemala versus, you know, one that is in Cuba, or one in Cuba versus in another place in Cuba, for instance, that's what we mean by assets. Thank you, Catherine, for posing that question. So I guess one of the things that I find in working with mining companies is that sometimes what the expectation seems to be is that analysts, investors, and others, they want to see, how do those high-level policies trickle down to the site? Like, how does that trickle down in terms of the enforcement of policies and systems? And are there some key metrics, maybe, something as limited as SASB, for instance, but just to be able to show for some of those key metrics, how are you performing? And those metrics will probably vary based on, where you're operating in some cases, or the sector that you're in. On the life cycle side, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but I find that anytime companies communicate things around life cycle, someone who's reading it, they probably just want to be able to see how you're doing it, that there's something that is kind of holistic, and that you've learned some things to make decisions, rather than that it is that they may know what to do from a data standpoint.
Yeah, I think the conversation is interesting. We've had lots of conversations with customers, or big name customers, and I'll cite BMW as an example, who are using reported data more and more as part of their procurement process.
Yeah.
And really vetting their selection of suppliers via publicly available information or responsible sourcing program data.
Uh-huh.
And so that's where it becomes really interesting, because their commentary in general, and this is for most of our downstream customers, is that SD reports just don't fit the bill, because when they're trying to compare against each, companies,
yeah,
the definition of most of the KPIs are so non-transparent that it's very difficult, and for people reading, to understand, if they're not specialists, the differences among the different KPIs amongst different companies. So there are limitations to these data tables.
Yeah, and I think that's why certain standards like SASB are existing, because they're trying to create a way for analysts, investors, and others to be able to have more of an apples to apples comparison by having a kind of a consistent metrics in place. And even though that may not result in apples to apples, it may at least result in apples to oranges rather than apples to horses or something, as a comparison.
All right, I think that's the last question, and I know we've kept people pretty long. I just want to thank Wes. Thank you so much for these insights and for taking the time, and for coming half an hour earlier than we originally told you to come. So, this has just been terrific, and I know there's been a lot of value here, and thank you very much for your time and expertise. If people have follow-up questions, don't hesitate to send me an email or whatever works. I mean, we're with the faculty. We're here to be supporting you. So let us know how we can do that. Super. Thank you.